Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining this special meeting of the Housing Committee, Wednesday, November 5th, 2014, here in the John Ferraro Council Chamber. I'm Gil Cedillo, chair of the committee, joined by my esteemed colleagues Felipe Fuentes and Councilmember Curran Price. I talk too much and somebody's supposed to. Yeah, so let's start with, I'd like to take item 1 and 2 together. They're basically the same subject matter, if that's okay.
Clay McCarter with the CLA. I'll quickly read the items. Item 1 is a communication from the mayor relative to the 41st program year of the Housing and Community Development Consolidated Plan. Item 2 is an adopted budget recommendation instructing the Housing Department to report to the Housing Committee with options to address on a long-term basis the loss of the CBDO funding.
Okay. I've got public comment cards. Want to hear from the public first?
Yeah, let's do that. I think that'll help.
Let's hear from the public first. I've got Miguel Vargas, Council District 14. Please join us.
Hey, good afternoon, council members. My name is Miguel Vargas. I'm from Councilman Huizar's office. Now, council member asked me to come and just speak on behalf of, speak to the fact that we understand that it's difficult given all the cutbacks that have happened over the years. But as we go forward and as we decide how to use our limited resources toward funding a lot of these great programs that are out there, that we please consider Family Source. They are a great resource to a lot of different communities citywide, and so we just ask that you keep them in mind. Thank you.
Antonia Ramirez. We have Antonia Ramirez.
Is it 1 minute or 2 minutes?
1 minute will be fine.
Okay, thank you. Before you make a third-year action plan, consider these crucial points. The housing and community go hand in hand. Now, when you rent or lease homes or housing to toxic tenants, i.e. wetbacks and Latino Chango gangbangers, who deteriorate the properties with vandalism, graffiti, home invasion robberies, mail theft, ID theft, loud toxic noise, mob lynchings, bullying, gang stalkings, invasion of privacy, audio and video spyware, electronic harassment, nosy and intrusive tenants, and or managers, fear and intimidation, brawls. They terrorize good tenants, obstructing your path along with rubbish everywhere and heinous crimes committed against civilized, legal law-abiding citizens. And I can assure you that the LAPD and County Sheriff's Department will not be there to help you. So again, please, I thought you were going to give him 2 minutes. So having said that, please.
Jessica Needham. Jessica Needham.
Thank you, Housing Committee. I'm here on behalf of the Center for the Pacific Asian Family. My executive director couldn't be here today. We're one of the agencies that's funded by the Domestic Violence Shelter Operations Program. We serve immigrant survivors of domestic violence, and all of the families that enter our shelters are at risk of being homeless due to domestic violence. The Mayor's Consolidated Plan includes the strategic goal of reducing and ending homelessness. The DVSO providers have specialized supportive services to ensure that survivors of violence don't have to become homeless. We don't provide shelter beds. We provide many supportive services that increase their safety, self-sufficiency, and access to resources. Police, prosecutors, and the hospitals rely on our shelter programs to make sure that survivors have a place to go after the initial abuse. We're an essential part of the continuum of care for survivors, and with the support of CDBG funding, we serve more than thousands of survivors every year. Last year, we experienced a 10% decrease in overall funding. Seems like it may be setting us up for more decreases. I just wanted to advocate that we restore the funding and ensure that these essential services are provided. Thank you.
Thank you. Parker Anderson. Parker.
Good afternoon. We have could the other 3 speakers that are also submitted cards join us?
Yes. Please join us. Please line up. It's Parker, is it Maggie? And Raul, and Veronica, in that order.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Parker Anderson. I work with the Watts Labor Community Action Committee. We have a family source center in South Los Angeles, Watts. Collectively here today, we represent the Coalition for Family Source Centers, and we would like to speak to the pending shortfall in the public services cap for this next year. I guess we'd like to start by especially thanking this committee and the council and the mayor for supporting the centers for the current year. We were placed under the public services cap. We appreciate that. We have a handout that we gave you that will sort of lay out some of our thoughts. It says we also appreciate the 5% cut. You may want to cross that out and say we accept it. But nonetheless, we were given the opportunity to operate fully this year and to continue to innovate. And what we'd like to do today is to stress two things. One, we'd like to share with you a little bit about our performance since we last spoke, and then we'd like to give you some of our thoughts about what we might do to deal with the shortfall in public services. Maggie Cervantes?
Maggie Cervantes, Executive Director of New Economics for Women, and we operate 2 family source centers in San Fernando Valley. And I'd like to just give you a brief update on our performance for 2013-2014. Based on a study that was performed by the California State University, they evaluated us, and we have served 43,127 unduplicated clients during this past year. 200,000, 55,000 services provided, 16 million in annual income and benefits served 11,000 client families. We had 3.6 million in EITC earnings that we helped process, 14.2 million of new economic activity in LA that was generated by 7.4 of non-local funds coming into the city of LA, and 6,931 educational outcomes produced for 3,721 unduplicated clients. So we can show that our performance has really assisted in the city for those low-income families.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Raul Estrada, the Executive Director with El Centro de Ayuda. In addition to what Maggie was just giving you, what I'd like to do is talk about a few things. And when we started this system in 2011, we started at $1 million. That dollar amount has dropped by 30%. We went from $1 million to $938,000 to $738,000 to currently at a funding level of $700,000. Now, we know that these are tough decisions, but I think there is a bottom line. There's that baseline where it's just very difficult to continue to operate those services. As Baggy mentioned, and it should be noticed, the family source system, gentlemen, is the only system within the city that services undocumented families. That's it. It's the only. At the same time, the return on the dollar for the family source system is almost $2 for every dollar spent. So for the $13 million, we've generated over $26 million in income and revenue to the city of Los Angeles. I think that's worth noting. At this point, I would like to say that we are committed to the system, and we ask for your support.
Good afternoon. Veronica Olmos with the Westlake Pico Union Family Source Center, Central City Neighborhood Partners. And as my colleagues had just suggested, one of our ideas that we would like you all to consider are 5 things. One, we know that the housing has done a preliminary assessment on the neighborhood revitalization strategy area, but a formal analysis would be helpful so everyone can review and make input as to their potential. 2, review the programs currently funded under the public services cap to determine if an alternate source of funding might be utilized to fund them instead, example, Workforce Investment Act. And then 3 and 4, hand in hand, we're looking at county funds. So option 1, or A, would be determine if the family source system could be augmented with the County of Los Angeles Department service dollars, example, Department of Mental Health, Department of Probation, Department of Children and Family Services. And then the other option with the county is if the CDBG Public Services funds or county CSBG funds could be made available to augment the FSCs. Another suggestion we have is to assess the block grant program income as a possible resource for increasing public services cap by analyzing project program income for the next 3 years to determine if the impact on public services cap in the future, and review the city's use of 108 funds and other strategies for increasing program income and therefore the city's public services cap in outlying years. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that conclude public comment? No cards?
Yes, that's all the cards.
Thank you. Can we hear from the mayor's office? Just the mayor right now. If you Yeah, housing, there's enough chairs. Why don't you guys come up also?
Great. Good afternoon, council members. Kevin Keller with the mayor's office. I'm here joined by Jackie Rodriguez of our office, who's going to be our lead on the con plan this year. This is an important first step in the process today. You know, we've just transmitted our opening letter. We do plan to be listening as well as working collaboratively with the council through this process, and do intend to release a proposed budget in January. As we all know, this is going to be a very challenging year. There is a 30% cut to our public service dollars. There will likely be widespread reductions in funding as we try to balance the cuts. We're also going to be focusing on shovel-ready implementation and focusing on spending the money that has been allocated. We also remain committed to advocating to raise the public service cap for Los Angeles. That's one of the key constraints on the funding here. So I'm going to hand it over to Jackie to give us a quick run through of the main points of the letter.
Good afternoon. The mayor's program, 41st year program, Housing Community Development Consolidated Letter was released October 8th, and it served as a notification for the 41st Annual Action Plan application process, also known as CPAS. It is anticipated that there will be potential reductions in the entitlement amount for Los Angeles for the from the 40th year based on housing funding. It's estimated that 3% decrease overall in CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds, 30% in home investment partnership programs, 7% in housing opportunities for persons living with AIDS, also known as HAPWA, and level funding for the Emergency Solutions Grant. Based on this, we also anticipate a 32% decrease in the cap for public services for the next year. There's smaller decreases of 3% anticipated for the planning and administrative activities, which is also capped. If the proposed federal reductions were realized at the city level, the amount of the home planning and administrative activities would also be decreased by 14%. The applications for the action plan were accepted from October 8th through October 28th. Any applications intended for the capital project should be shovel-ready. Projects where construction were to begin as early as April 2015. As later stated, no new applications will be accepted for public services or planning and administrative activities due to the caps mentioned prior. We thank you and we look forward to working with you, working with the council to put together the 41st consolidated plan.
I will just add, as part of particularly item 1, with the cut in services is 30%. One of the issues that continues to go on, of course, is the program revenue is not there, and then the money tends to be cut on the federal level, so that's continuing to provide challenges. But in addition, that also has exacerbated other problems inside the budget, which includes how fast we spend with loss of those services that used to spend very timely and regularly taking care of the clientele of the city. We also are having a 1.5 times issue, which is every end of January, we take a look at the unexpended balances that are sitting on the account, and we cannot have more than 1.5 times sitting in our bank account. And that's also driven, unfortunately, by program revenue has to be added into that. So when we looked at this year's comm plan and you're going forward, one of the reasons why a big push for shovel ready is we are carrying projects from past comm plan years, some reaching back to 36, 37, 38, clearly 39 still in there, 40, and so these are all dragging us down in our 1.5 times issue, which currently is probably about 1.95, and we have to be at 1.5 by the end of January. So I think that's where you're starting to see the push, and necessary so, where we've had conversations with departments about unexpended balances to make sure that we're getting that money moved, making sure departments are putting in all expenditures timely, and making sure that future projects going forward are ready to go so these things aren't bearing down on our future projects and how we'd like to plan for our projects. So as part of item 2 on the agenda, there was a conversation with the loss of CDBO during the last budget cycle to take a look at alternatives. And one of those alternatives specifically asked to look at was the Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy area, also known as NRSA. And I'll just take a quick moment to go through some of the highlights here, if you will. The HUD allows grantees to develop comprehensive approaches to address their problems along the way. Grantees may designate and target a local area for revitalization. The communities with approved nurses are offered enhanced flexibility under the plan. So under that thought, it was the hope that we'd be able to transfer the services underneath that. As you start to read forward through that, you realize it's really enhancing the existing services, so it's not really fixing that problem, but it does have some interesting opportunities inside there. HUD provides the criteria for what may constitute a NRSA, and then as part of that, you have to put forth a strategy, and you have to submit those strategies to HUD and get those areas designated by HUD, so it's not just city-controlled. They're tied to the life of our consolidated plan. Well, we're entering the third year of our consolidated plan, so any NRSA that would go forward actually would only have 3 years left. Each year we'd have to actually meet certain benchmarks that are laid out in our plan for those NRSAs. Basically, communities with approved NRSAs, I mentioned, have increased flexibility, but we're still responsible for meeting all the public benefit, all the CDBG requirements, and everything else going forward. So that means all the same CDBG requirements as before. At times, it would allow us a little bit less paperwork on some of the documenting. Every time we use CDBG inside the city, it is a lot of documentation verifying who's in there, whether it's a job, whether it's a low mod income, whether it's a limited clientele. All those things must be verified along the way. A NRSA at times will help eliminate some of that paperwork, but not all of it. But that was one of the aspects that are positive to a NRSA. Anything else associated with a NRSA starts to go to how you set it up and what are your goals inside of it. It is a great tool if you're trying to be strategic in your capital investment. It is a great tool if you identified an area and you've done all the necessary studies and you're taking a look at what additional service may be needed in there on top of the services already provided in the city. It provides you that opportunity. But as with many things with HUD, it always adds a little but to the end of every sentence and a little challenge in having to get it forward. So HUD says, in order to do these areas, the areas must be contiguous across the community. They must be primarily residential. As defined by us, it's basically at 65% or greater residential use, which proved to be a challenge inside the city because of the various different uses from industrial, commercial to open space. As part of that definition, we use parks because they're primarily for residential use to help meet that threshold along the way. Otherwise, a great number of communities that seem like they would be able to make it would not make it under that threshold. And then the areas that are designated, 70% of those communities have to be low mod income. So 70% of the people inside that area must be low mod. The challenge in this city is when you go census block by census block, it's interesting. You have very low next to quite high and something in between. And when you add them all together, you would get census blocks that would not come together and give you the right percentages for low mod, providing an interest challenge. We held several meetings. Actually, I would say several. We held a lot of internal meetings going through various subjects, working through this NRSA process. And working through those, we were forced in the beginning to use HUD 2010 data. Under HUD 2010 data, interestingly enough, and I'll use Councilmember Pacoima as an example of an area that was looked at. There were numerous areas looked at across the city, from Watts to Pacoima to Westlake to Boyle Heights to over by south of USC. But using Pacoima as an example, when we did it down around, a circle around, if you will, City Hall and around joining community all the way up to the public housing, interestingly enough, under the 2010 census data, it did not meet the income requirements necessary for a NRSA. So all of a sudden, things that seemed obvious were not working inside in order to do the NRSA. As we move forward, this July, HUD released a new set of numbers, the ACS numbers, for 2010. And fortunately, now Pacoima became a potential possible, and so did some of the others inside of the city. But it still left us with several hurdles about the rest of the requirements for HUD. So one of the key requirements is HUD asks you to do a very strategic assessment, which be in line with doing a strategic revitalization. So needing to know the number of businesses, the housing needs, the rents, the home prices, number of people employed, neighborhood improvement, public facilities, economic development, current services provided in the levels of unemployment, opportunities for economic development in the area, unmet need for facilities or services, and then organizations available to assist with and implementing that strategy. So you're going through all of those things. So as part of our look, we took a look at where the city was doing other investments as well inside the city. We documented where the family source centers were, where other services provided, where parks, rec, anybody who would show up inside these areas where we identified where we might be able to meet the income and other needs to make sure that we had opportunities for leveraging. Because one of the key things, as we'll get to in just a moment, is that we're going to have to leverage funds if you go down the path of a NRSA. So what these strategies had to include: the area needed to describe the opportunities for economic development within the neighborhood, including activities that create meaningful jobs for residents. They want to know how it promotes revitalization of neighborhood and promote economic opportunity for residents. The analysis discussed certain types of facilities for service, foster lending and institution within the neighborhood, community organizations to assist, services that are currently unused or underutilized within the community, fledgling projects started but unable to take place due to lack of funding. The strategy should identify impediments to the community faced during implementation. Impediments include hesitation from private sources, banks who want to invest in the area, community opposition to development activities, inexperience in community organizations, and so forth. The strategies must include goals and strategies in order to measure. There will be annual measurements associated with that. Failure to meet those annual measurements puts you at risk of not having the NRSA continued for the following year. So as I said, we're in a 5-year plan. We're in the 3rd year, so it would only be a 3-year plan approved by HUD at this particular moment in time if going down that path. So some of the examples of you see when we take a look at around the city or other cities around the U.S., I should say, is number of businesses created, number of jobs created, increase, decrease, decrease in unemployment, increase in employment, job training centers open, could be reduction for families on welfare in a measurable fact, community lending institutions attracted, job training programs. Those are the type of examples given on what could be done or what would have to be done inside the NRSA. So I say all that to get to the true challenges inside the NRSA. So when we looked around the city, we came down and tested it basically in 6 areas inside the city, from Pacoima to Watts to Boyle Heights to south of USC to Westlake, a couple others, to see how we could manage that and if you could get the answer to the question at the end of the day was, can we get more services inside there? Can we save the existing services inside there? Or is this more of an exercise about really being strategic about how we do our investment in the city? As a practice, a NRSA is a great practice or option for being extremely strategic inside the city about how you do your capital investment, particularly with CDBG. But that has to be balanced against the fact that once you commit to the NRSA, you commit to the NRSA, and it starts to limit your flexibility on how you can use funds throughout the rest of the city because it's going to tie up those funds. So part of that was taking a look, okay, we have to show an impact forward inside the NRSA. So how much CDBG would have to be dedicated just to provide the economic development? So at a minimum, we assigned $2 million to each NRSA to start with. So 2 times 6, that was 12. So that's the first $12 million off of approximately an $85 million budget this year, less our administration costs and other programs that have to be delivered through the budget. So there goes the first 12. If we were going to provide additional services, the 6, so we figured we used a number of $750,000. So now you're talking about another $4+ million, $16 million inside those areas. And then you had to ask your question, was that enough to actually provide the impact that makes HUD accept the plan? And that was the real challenge right there. So you realize now, odds are you're going to need more CDBG allocated to that project area, and that's not just 1 year, that's the entire year of the plan. So $2 million plus $2 million plus $2 million for each project area, or for each NRSA area. And if it has to be more, then it has to be more. And then you realize that the services are enhanced services, not the existing services. They want to know what needs to be improved upon, not just where are you trying to move your money around. One of HUD's conversations with us when we spoke to DC is, and they keep an eye out for, is they see cities trying to use nurses to get around the service cap. He was very blunt with us in the phone call. And so that is one of the things they watch for. So they are making sure that whatever your plan is well thought out, methodical, but really is about revitalizing the entire area, not just shifting some of your costs underneath. So we look down, you go through, we ran all these exercises, and now you realize we don't have enough in CDBG to actually effectuate a change, so we know we'll have to leverage. But we also know housing is part of the equation that has to be done in there, so now we'd have to allocate some of the limited home resources we have in the city. We know from the upcoming budget we're looking at possibly a 30% cut in home, which would bring us down from our last $21 million allocation plus program revenue was 26, somewhere down to 14 plus program revenue, maybe putting us about 21 million. So now we're dedicating home funds as well to these very specific targeted areas. And all of a sudden you find yourself spending $3 million to get an extra $750 in services or trying to get additional services in the area. I will say services are valuable because they help offset future costs for other things along the way, but it's the balancing act of how you want to spend your funds inside the city to effectuate change. So you're having to dedicate your home funds. Well, in order to do housing, that means you also have to allocate your tax credits. So we know we have a 2-year pipeline on home and tax credits, so now you've committed all your home, you've committed your tax credits, and you've committed your CDBG in these very specific areas. And if the original goal was to help offset the cost of services, I'm not sure we've met that goal at all. We've found a way to invest very strategically and meaningful by doing studies and being a deep dive invest, but it did not fix the carrying cost of existing services. We know from last year's budget that general fund covered $9 million of existing costs for previous services. That $9 million technically cannot go back into CDBG. We know with this year we're looking at a public service from 15 or so million down to a little over $10 million. We'll just call that an additional cut. So we're looking at about $14 million gap in services. I would suggest that the services offset higher costs in other areas because that's what services do when you provide domestic violence and family source type services. So they have importance. But the reality is those costs don't get back into the NRSA in the way that we would like them to if we were trying to offset those costs. I will say along the way, and I know it was mentioned by one of the speakers, we looked at talking to the county about a county increasing its participation in those options, and I think those conversations are ongoing. I think they'll also look to see where our participation as a city is and inside those conversations. We also had a conversation with LISC, who's an intermediary who provides funding to nonprofits to do services and other things. Turned out to be a fruitful conversation. We thought actually at the time they could partner with the Family Source Centers, but it turns out I think they find economic and workforce development and the workforce centers a better partnership. So they actually got a lead for some additional funds. And then the last conversation is about with foundations, with a number of the entities being able to demonstrate their value to the community and forthwith. Those are the types of things that foundations would be interested in. And so cobbling together some type of package that would work for them and work for us is also a potential. But as we went through the NRSA aspect, we got down at the end of the day, we were spending more money in one place, and it wasn't fixing the original issue that was asked for, which is how do we maintain the existing services in the city with the current budget. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Gibson, a couple of questions, and I'm going to jump around, so forgive me because I'm sort of trying to refresh my memory with all of this. You mentioned that the ACS numbers; those are the American Census, the revised census survey numbers, right?
The new title for the census.
I forget what the acronym stands for. Did that help our case? You said it seems like it helped in places the NRSA.
And the upside is it helped our case. The downside is it did so because it showed that we were poorer off than we were before. And so in the sense that for Pacoima, to be a very clear example, under the 2000, didn't qualify income-wise. Under the 2010, it did. It did. So in that regard, it made the income qualification work.
Okay, so it made the case a little bit better for the NRSA model, but still your overall goal, I sort of hear loud and clear. It's trying to figure out how to fit the services that we currently have inside of this NERSA model, and sort of dollar for dollar, you said it was expensive. In your analysis, though, did you all contemplate doing a hybrid, or maybe, and notwithstanding sort of the inequity in terms of what areas would sort of potentially get more because NERSA, you might have to front load some more dollars in order to sort of balance out the service delivery that's currently happening. But did you all contemplate doing that? NERSA in some places, your sort of FSC, is it a either-or proposition with HUD?
I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think it's interesting how the stuff reads. It asks you what existing services are out there already. So it wants you to survey that and say that is one of the many things it does. And then what is actually needed in that specific strategic targeted area? What additional services needed to meet the goals of what that revitalization is? So whether that's the jobs, the housing aspect. So when it reads that way, some of those goals may very well align themselves with some of the services we have. And some absolutely may not, because each nurse is going to be specific on what's rising to the top of a service need, but not just rising to the top, but what need is tying to the revitalization effort. To answer your other question is, I don't believe it was an either-or conversation. I think you can have a family source out in the general city population, if you will, not inside the NERSA. You could take a look and say, the NERSA, in order to meet its revitalization goals, it needs more of these services, and you're trying to do them more intensively inside of there. The challenge is that you're intensifying the services there. You're not doing anything for the cost of the existing family source center because it won't be inside of there. So let me go. I apologize. There's so many little pieces in here that they're running around in my head and they get technical.
Mine
so
too.
when you form the NERSA, you're going to have to form another CDBO like we used to have. And that CDBO is to be exclusively for activities inside of the NERSA. Right. So those outside aren't going to be inside because you can't award that to them. You can only award, so you'd have to form a brand new CDBO and go through that process in order to effectuate whatever that service eventually is going to be, because that will be their service area.
Sure, and again, let me just zoom out a little bit, because to me it seems that, I'm just wondering if the analysis has been done to, and again, there is, colleagues, it's not to sort of pick one area over another. This is just a matter of example. It's not that I'm advocating for the 7th Councilmatic District by itself, but just to sort of play the example out a little bit. I'm just wondering if there wasn't a way to sort of identify areas that, on balance, the NERSA would sort of help us underwrite the service delivery costs in some areas, and in other areas we sort of do the typical model. And it's not to put the mayor's office on the spot, but if we've already in this last sort of fiscal year dedicated $9 million to sort of, it was $9 million for the FSC, $11 million for the other programmatic stuff, right? The housing, home, offset, grid. Am I getting these numbers mixed up?
It was a $9 million general fund put in to offset the loss in services last.
Right, and then we also did some money to offset the other loss too, didn't we? On the on some of the home funds, or was it just the $9 million one time in total?
I only recall the $9 million, so my staff's saying the same thing too.
Plus the
$15 million CDBG public services.
15. Okay, so it's 9 plus the 15.
Yes.
Understanding that there are
That's
different
the
types
total
of dollars, right?
Mm-hmm.
The total service sort of contribution that the
Yes.
general fund made to sort of get to a place where we're limping along, and we are now. I'm just wondering if that analysis couldn't be done to sort of maybe pick a couple of places where NERSA could work and take a hybrid approach and sort of go back to sort of the traditional thing and ask HUD for flexibility, understanding from a program management aspect that's probably difficult because you're going to have to sort of maintain a couple of areas with the intensity and the rigor that the plan would dictate. But I'm wondering in total if that were the will of the mayor and the council, if we're going to make a contribution from the general fund, if that wouldn't sort of help us get to a place where instead of making a $9 and $15 million contribution, it's something south of that.
Yeah.
Just to make all of this more palatable, because otherwise, if we go sort of the way that we're going here, we're sort of back to the drawing board in a lot of ways with the FSC, the cap, and there's certainly a reduction in services. So I'm just wondering if a hybrid approach couldn't be modeled.
Yeah, you are correct that we're kind of back at the beginning a little bit
Yeah.
having this conversation. The 15 million was the funds that came from the CDBG. The 9 million is the funds that came from the general fund.
I'm sorry, okay, that's
I
right,
think
sorry.
yeah, some of the answer to your question is yes, we can ask HUD, absolutely, because that half of what we do is end up asking HUD and waiting for that answer that comes back. One of the challenges is, and they were very clear in that first call, is we're watching you to see if you're just trying to shift your service cost to the thing.
Right.
So, but to answer your question, is there a way possibly to do that? I would say, well, we have the existing services, and let's say they're out here in the thing, and let's say they got funded as they did this last time with perhaps general fund, and then we had a NERSA. And we started investing and then allocating very specific CDBG and home dollars in there because that'll be the requirement. We could intensify the services inside that NERSA in that manner. And so then we'd be adding CDBG for capital, then we'd be adding home for housing, and then we'd be adding additional CDBG for services in that specific area.
For 3 years.
For 3 years. And that's just that'll be taking it right out of we have the same pot of money as we've always had, which is clearly shrinking, but that's where it would come from. So you could do an intense, but it really didn't do anything for your outside, but it might do something it would do something very specifically for those inside the NERSA. I will say,
Yeah, I just suggested
We've thought about that.
there will be a budgetary conversation at some point whether we propose additional sort of support from the general fund or not, and then the council will decide whether it agrees or not. But if there was a way to sort of figure out how to split the difference by coming up with a hybrid approach, maybe minimizing how much it is that the general fund would have to support, understanding that you're sort of married to a couple of areas for a lot more time intensely, but understanding that folks will get sort of their turn in a rotational type of sort of situation. I just wonder
Over
if that
time.
modeling could sort of say to us, gosh, for only $6 million out of the general fund, we could sort of limp along in a sort of a way that satisfies HUD. And granted, you're stuck in a couple of places, not stuck. You're focused in a couple of places for a little bit longer, but maybe there's a way to sort of make the budget conversation a little bit easier for us.
might be, and I'll just caution, perhaps there is a way, but caution that if your general fund now going back to CDBG is a no-no. So
you can't
because
do that.
now you're just using CDBG to supplant what the city pays for, and that's
I see.
That's not a
Okay,
practice.
so there's a rub.
That's a
there.
frowned upon practice.
Got it. All right. Let me zoom in. I'm sorry. Yes.
If I could add one thing, Julia O'Leary. The other piece would be, for example, this year we have about $20 million in existing neighborhood improvement projects. So it would be getting agreement from some council offices that maybe have been getting money in their district for some years, that we would need some of that to be applied to the neighborhood revitalization strategy areas in order to have enough money to really accomplish our goals in those areas. So that would be a piece of it. And you mentioned the rotation, and maybe it would be in, next 5-year plan, we would have some other nurses in eligible areas.
So is that sort of going to be fleshed out a little bit and sort of spoken to us about? Because it sounds like that might be one avenue to sort of go.
If we were given direction that there might be some agreement on that, certainly, we could explore that. But it's really looking at, taking from Peter to pay Paul in some ways, as far as some council districts would get less in order to fund things for capital projects for the nurses.
And that wouldn't.
But it would have to be that way regardless, because you're going to have to dedicate a certain portion of your CDBG in your home just to meet the goals, just to even set up the NERSA to have a service conversation. So somebody will have to give up something. I think the other challenge is if there's a service that's paid for out of general fund, moving it to CDBG will be frowned upon because that's just one of their HUD's rules. Intensifying a service, enhancing a service, that's when we start to have conversation, which is where NERSA can intensify and enhancify an existing service that's going on there. So you say you need more intensive services inside to meet it. But then we're having this conversation from the study, not what you do now, what is actually needed inside that NERSA.
Got it. Let me jump around for a little bit. So just refresh my memory, sort of the program revenue. What is that? How does it come about? Because it's been a little while. I sort of just think of the CDBG dollars. Where does the program revenue come from?
Basically, repayment of loans, if you will, sometimes selling of property, any money that comes in from generated by the properties associated with CDBG in one way or another.
Very good. So at this point, I mean, you're providing us sort of a status of where we are, and it's sort of tough. Is there any sort of recommendation, or just short of a recommendation, an idea that you all are moving towards? Because I am sort of moved by, not sort of, I'm absolutely intrigued by the idea that the coalition's bringing forward in terms of trying to figure out how to really leverage the investment that the county could make. But do we run into the same rub there, that supplants? I mean, is there a way for us to take credit for some of the things that they're doing and coordinate with them? I know that sort of from a governance perspective, we don't have the authority to tell them, but I'm just wondering if there isn't a way or an avenue for us to really leverage the investment that they're making. Again, just picking on Pacoima and not advocating for them necessarily, but the probation department just moved into the Van Nuys corridor across the street from the Pacoima City Hall. I've got an FSC that is half a mile away from all of that. To me, it seems like there's a unique situation there, but presumably the probation department will bring resources to bear in the area, and those should account for something, at least from my perspective, as enhancing some of the service delivery that's already taking place there by the FSC. Is there a way for us to leverage with the county?
Well, yes. I think one of the avenues that was explored.
Well, that's why I say, from a governance perspective, I understand that we have little to no sort of control over that. But I mean, this, if there was an opportunity that HUD says, hey, this makes an awful lot of sense, we'll count that investment towards this model, then that would hopefully make it so that we want to figure out a joint powers or some sort of memorandum of understanding or something to get the credit for what the county is already sort of providing in an area.
Oh, I thought you very good. I was thinking you were going another way with your statement there for a moment. I think as part of the group had said before, working with the county and trying to increase the contracts that they have with them as providing another revenue source to support their existing activities, that's a conversation that should be continuing and ongoing. I think that's an important conversation to have, and I think the county will also ask, where is the city inside this conversation? So it's definitely an important one to have for them, including the city, when those conversations take place. With regards to the activities that are going on inside, let's say, a proposed NERSA, such as probation and those types of activity, when you go to do the study of that area, these are the things that are showing up that are going on. So if there was some type of service or something being generated by probation, it would be listed off as one of the things that's already there in the area. So then the next question isn't, you're not trying to get credit from them, you're basically including them in your plan and trying to identify what else is needed inside the area. And it's not the services that'll drive you crazy inside of a NERSA, unfortunately. It's the capital and the economic development and the housing benchmark goals that have to be obtained on the other side, for which that probation piece wouldn't help. But maybe partnering inside of there, help offsetting costs, making sure you're having conversations ongoing with the county. That's definitely
and they
helpful.
could probably help us with the job placement goals in the area
Yeah,
that I think we could leverage. We also looked at what other capital investments that we could find in Bureau of Engineering, CAO reports regarding where other investments were going on in the city. Unfortunately, they were pretty spread out. We weren't seeing anything really clustered in the area, but that might be another area to look as far as for future planning, what other kind of capital projects could be focused in those areas as well, so that we're able to help meet the goals and really focus on particular areas.
My last question, Mr. Chair. So what is sort of your timing? I mean, it sounds like this is a great update. Well, not a great update. It's an update on sort of what's ahead. What's sort of the timeline that you all are thinking, and when do you think you come back with sort of a couple of options for us?
I'm going to say that as we sit right now, I feel that we're at the end of the NRSA option timeline, and it can be debatable in many ways, but with regards, unless we're going down the NRSA to be extremely more strategic in our capital investment and our job activities inside the city, having this conversation specifically for services, I'm not quite following that path as actually working to help resolve some issues. So having conversations with the county, engaging in conversations with foundations, and continue to have conversation with different intermediaries beyond LISC, perhaps enterprise, is a definite conversation that needs to continue to go forward. So I think that I think we're at toward the end of the NRSA conversation.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So be creative. Do we have some other capacity to, I don't know, get a waiver, create some model that looks like our own version of NRSA that we could then take to the feds and get some type of buy-in from them?
We can. The NRSA model is the way to get the buy-in, unfortunately, to the feds, with the caveat that they're watching the service activities associated with it to make sure they're further. We do have the ability to do NRSA activities. In conversations with Dallas, they went about doing something just short of a NRSA to try to do capital and economic and job activity inside of an area. It does not carry the services, nor does it carry the exemption for meeting all the steps that you have to meet for getting a NRSA and so forth. With that doesn't rise to the level that HUD would accept. We can try various models. HUD has set down those rules, and particularly in that private conversation that we had on the phone with them, with the service cap and what they're watching for, they want to know that we're expanding, not shifting our funding priorities. That's really what that conversation has been about. I think if we have conversations in the future about funding, perhaps it's how we start tying service needs to new income sources. This is a similar conversation. It reminds me of housing and the fact that we've lost so much money in housing, whether we tie it to boomerang funds and a portion of boomerang funds coming back, the CRA funds coming back, or some other type of housing or some other type of tax that's associated with supporting service activities that offset costs in other ways. Perhaps it's a look at, as crazy as I'll say it, is the LAPD budget or the fire department budget. By if we provide enough services in one area, does it cut their costs on the other side that it actually starts saving them on a 2-to-1 basis? And perhaps it's that time, as the group had said, as the coalition had said, to start taking a look at the overall services and the impact and where they're starting to save dollars overall, so that this conversation can find a new source of funds that can actually be used.
Senator Price?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It is a little sobering, certainly, in a time of need, particularly in some areas of the city that really benefit from these kinds of services, these wraparound services. I was curious, though, this NRSA, is this a new program? Is it like the last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or how long has it been around? And is there a limitation on the number that can be formed in an area in the city?
NRSAs are old, but I don't know how old they are. You may remember talking about?
They've been around for a while. In fact, what we've been told by HUD is they're considering trying to do away with them, so they're not really liking them. But no, we have been not told that there is any kind of limitation. They do each have to be approved, so it would be the quality of the strategic plan and the goal and investments in them is what they would be looking at.
Yeah.
We get caught by how much money do we have available to invest and leverage to carry a NRSA, quite honestly. Because you have to meet those benchmarks annually, and whatever your goals are, that means whatever pot of money you have to have enough to effectuate that goal.
Yeah, well, if we can't get the money there, I definitely believe that we should be trying to better fund the family source centers. I think they play a unique role. I think they're positioned to expand and to provide the kinds of services that we're talking about that are missing in some of these areas as well. Any plans afoot to figure out how we can expand funding for the Family Source Centers?
I include Family Source, and I include others, even in DV and domestic violence and those, because I think all of them actually have a great value inside the city, and quite honestly are saving us money in other places that we just haven't recognized yet. And so that review and look at, how it can be offset by other costs that are reduced inside the city, from fire department who makes calls, and police department who makes calls, by addressing some of these issues that would not come up otherwise, and then the impact of those programs. We've had conversations, I know I've had conversations, particularly with Manny, about the intermediaries, talking to the foundations. We had the conversation with the county on how to work better with them, and I think the coalition of providers across the board are also having their own conversations as well across the board, because most of them are funded in many different ways, but the city is a big part of that funding, there's no doubt.
Yeah, well, certainly the county is a factor, and even the state. I mean, not that the state is in a wash with money, but there are some resources there that I think can be targeted, and we need to be more strategic. And that's why I think the Family Source Centers are real key, because I think they provide that kind of strategic presence in communities already. And we should always be trying to leverage resources, limited resources especially.
It's one of the reasons why I think foundations is also a great way to go. If you have a product that you can show measurable results, that you can show the impact to the community, and you can show that if you leverage what we have, we can provide greater impact to the community, those are the interesting things to foundations, showing impact.
Final words.
Talk to me a little bit about sort of the cuts that we're experiencing. It seems like there's a downward trend here in federal funding, and I'm not terribly excited about the results on Tuesday in terms of sort of us having to wait for HUD's approval. Actually, it's Congress's approval, isn't it, right, on some of this funding here?
Yes.
Yes.
So just tell me a little bit about how have we been, as a matter of percentage, have we been losing the same amount for the last couple of years, and what is the expectation, and when does Congress act on this?
I will say CDBG has been slowly dropping. I think we had like a little percent cut drop before, but it keeps cutting back. For a minute there, it was in a lot more jeopardy, and I think the pressure, particularly on a congressional level, came to the point that when you cut CDBG, you actually cut the lifeblood of cities for a lot of the work they do, and so it started seeing less cuts. When you go to the home program, which is for the housing aspect, it was probably the first one that started getting in the paper, particularly from the Washington Post, and is yet to actually recover from, okay, there's some challenges and issues in the home program, but the fact is the home program provided a great deal of funding for affordable housing, which is pretty much the base of how you start a lot of things. You get people housing, keep jobs, education, the whole 9 yards, the affordable housing. And we have seen that continuously cut over and over and over again. I remember the times not that long ago where we were at 46, and this year we were at technically the allocation being 21. So we've seen some dramatic cuts. And then you look at this upcoming year and the House appropriation being another 30%. I was like, either you don't understand how home helps you, or you're not really liking the program. I'm not quite clear. And the interesting thing is, inside the federal government, if you're actually watching some of their budget issues, when you look at the Housing Authority and public housing and how they're trying to refinance, they're trying to get that off their books. And so they shift that over and they start the RAD program, which is a very interesting program. But that starts to tie up with your home allocation and your 9% tax credits. And on the other side of the house, they keep cutting the home allocation. So across the board, they keep attacking themselves and trying to shift the ball to the other one on how they finance things. I think the other issue that HUD currently has, particularly with CDBG, is that home took all those attacks, but I think CDBG is still in jeopardy on Capitol Hill. And I think it's either going to be the legislators making changes, or HUD itself who's going to start making changes. I think Julie clearly alluded to it, to what they said was, looking to have NRSA just disappear. So a little challenging. You add the election results. I'm talking about things that are all just before the election results. Add that little spin to it. It's going to do everybody a great deal of good to keep advocating, but more importantly, not just saying this is a valuable resource, but actually quantifying. I think a great deal of groups have not quantified how well their impact is on your economy, on how it saves you dollars, and how it helps you meet your other goals along the way. And I think for survival's sake, we all better start doing it better.
If I could add also, what we've heard from folks that manage our portfolio is because the federal funds have been coming down, we have been unable to loan money out like we did in the past, which is where our program income is coming from. So that our program income will also slowly be decreasing because we don't have the funds to loan out any longer.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Clear as mud. So let's bring it back away from the feds, back to Los Angeles. Last year we used general fund. Are you engaged with the mayor's office? Are we talking, is the mayor's office talking about the prospects of us using general fund, and is there a commitment to us moving in that direction?
Yeah, this is Kevin Keller with the mayor's office. At this point, this is just an initial discussion. We obviously are looking at every tool out there. As we know, we're likely facing cuts on a citywide scale in the general fund as well. So my understanding from last year, there was a one-time allotment. Obviously, that's something that can be looked at, but right now we're looking at proposing the cuts that we need to make the balance here, and then looking at potentially other options as well. So we don't have any commitments at this time.
Amongst many of the mayor's attributes is his ability to be outside the box and to bring resources. When you think of some of the programs that we've initiated, any thoughts on resources coming from the philanthropic community?
Yeah, again, Kevin Keller, that seems like something we definitely all need to consider. I think that's something that we can put in our list as well as everyone else's list, but we are basically starting this process again, looking at every option we can to restore and maintain funding. And these are critical programs. Much of the funding is outside the city's control in terms of what comes in under these programs. We're seeing cuts. I think the creativity is that how can we look at our own funding, look at foundation funding, look at philanthropy, so we can take that back, but we are spending our time trying to do everything we can to minimize the pain of these cuts.
So it's interesting last night, if you looked at the news programs, how California goes against the trends. And so obviously Washington is not going to be the friendly environment that we all hoped for. But Sacramento could be. It seems that given the changes and the relationships of the mayor's office with the governor's office, we all celebrated the new pro tem from Los Angeles. It seemed like that could be in the mayor's agenda, on the mayor's Sacramento agenda, is to find some relief, if not some, to supplant from the feds. Actually look to Sacramento so that we could be our own independent self-help state and city that is leading the nation. And so any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's well said. I mean, I think that's something we can take back. And obviously the mayor is committed to looking at every funding source that we can, including, I think, the suggestion of right here in California as well is something we want to look at.
Senator? No. Let me do it. What do you want? Right. So for the, we heard from the groups that are here, the nonprofits. I think it has to be disconcerting at this moment. I think what would be helpful is if we could at least get some plan or some plan that from the mayor's office about how we're going to move forward here. What are the options? What things look like, and how we anticipate different scenarios and how we go forward. Does that make sense?
If it's the chair's desire, sure.
Well, I think at least notice for everyone, regardless of whatever the news is, that notice is critical. And we should at least be able to get something in writing about what our options are, what the various scenarios are. 30 days?
Yeah, this is Kevin with the mayor's office. At this point, I mean, we're delighted to be here, to be collaborative in terms of all struggling with the same challenge. We will be releasing our proposal in January. That's what we're working towards. We certainly can keep collaborating and maybe even participating in different ways. Look forward to working with the leadership of this committee as well, having a chance to kind of dialogue a little more on that would be great. But that's where we are. We might have our departments might be able to help with some of the options as well. We can maybe turn to them, but that's kind of our next transmittal will probably be the budget, and we're happy to stay in the loop on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's, the candor is appreciated, and I think the notice is valued, and so we appreciate all of you for being here today.
Mr. Chair, would you like to adjourn the meeting?
No, since I haven't adjourned it, we have one last request.
Okay.
So housing. So we have one last request, and it's along the same lines as the polite request to the mayor's office. We'd also like to be a little more directive with you guys, is to give us a plan and some scenarios about how we deal with this situation. Okay? Does that address all our concerns?
Mr. Chair, sorry.
Yes.
City Clerk's office. Just to clarify, this item is being continued. I didn't catch the disposition.
My staff tells me approve and send to council with this recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
We want to report back, yes.
Okay.
30 days in writing. Okay. Thank you. Now we're done? Can we adjourn now?
Yes,
Okay.
that concludes the agenda.
Meeting's adjourned.